In this session, we're going to be looking at some of the history of the use of watermills in Britain. As we know, the main mechanism of the watermill uses hydropower to generate movement in order to complete a process. These processes included grinding or rolling in industries which were involved in making flour, paper, and wood. What many of you may not know is that watermills can be classified into two main categories, depending on the position of the wheel. The first is known as a vertical wheel, which occurred much more frequently than the other, known as a horizontal wheel. This latter specification was evident in early examples of the mill, but seems to have been dropped in favor of vertical mills from around the 13th century. The earliest known examples of mills come from Roman Britain, where horizontal wheels, originally invented by the Greeks, were used. The Domesday Book, which was written around the year 1086, listed approximately 6,000 watermills in Britain. Almost 300 years later, it's estimated that this figure had likely doubled. It's reported that some of the mills continued working into the 20th century, but only a small number of these survive today in various states of repair. Although it is probable that the majority of mills were designed with one purpose, many mills often changed function, depending on demand and availability of raw materials, but this was unlikely to have necessitated a change to the position of the wheel. Due to the very nature of how watermills were driven, the majority of mills were located on a riverbank in a river valley. This would allow the flow from the river to turn the wheel, enabling the process. However, differences in the river flow, due to seasonal variations in rainfall, would affect the efficiency of the mill. In other examples, the mill was constructed and set away from the riverbank. Then, a man-made channel would divert the water from the river into the channel to force the wheel to move. Occasionally, a dam was built to allow water to be conserved in times of low flow, and this often led to the creation of a mill pond where water would collect when the mill was not in use. These two examples of watermills were rather restricted in where they could be located, and therefore were limited in how far they could be spread across the country. There were two ways to combat this. Firstly, the construction of tide mills aimed to enable millers to relocate away from rivers. A tide mill uses seawater, driven by the rise and fall of the ocean tides. These were naturally situated on the coasts, at an inlet or an estuary. Similar to some of their river-based counterparts, tide mills often consisted of mill ponds, which were closed off when the tide fell to create a reservoir of water to allow milling to continue. The River Thames in London is a tidal river, and in the 18th century there were an estimated 76 tide mills in the city, with some on London Bridge itself. An alternative to the tide mill was known as the ship mill. This consisted of a mill with a wheel housed on a floating deck, which was usually placed in the middle of a river, where the flow was fastest. As the mill was floating on the surface of the river, the water levels didn't generally affect the continued use of the mill, unlike its landlocked equivalents. Piers were built from the land to allow access to the mill, and a mechanism existed so that the structure could be pulled to the side of the river to avoid it becoming an obstruction. However, as river traffic began to increase, the existence of the ship mill hindered progress, and it soon became abandoned. Even though tide mills and ship mills enabled the use of hydropower to be spread across the country, it appeared that windmills were an even more effective mill to carry out the same functions. These mills came to Britain in the 12th century and proved to be popular. This was because they were cheaper to build than any kind of watermill and were more flexible in where they could be located. These windmills had to be situated facing in one direction in a hilly area in order for the mechanism to work. This would indicate that windmills were just as restricted as watermills. Improvements were made, though, and the post mill allowed the sails of the windmill to be moved in any direction to catch the wind. Making the tower of the windmill higher also made it possible for windmills to be located in less hilly areas. Therefore, with these innovations, the spread of windmills across the country was relatively quick in comparison to that of watermills. Even though wind power tended to be more effective than hydropower, both fell out of use in the 1880s when steam power came into effect. Due to the advent of the steam revolution, milling could be done away from hilltops and rivers and placed in more efficient locations, such as near docks for easy transportation of goods around the world. This development meant the watermill in most countries was rendered obsolete, apart from in a few developing countries that still continue to use them, and now mainly remain out of historical interest and importance.